Earlier today, President Trump signed a new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico at the G20 summit. The newly signed USMCA replaces the North American Free Trade Agreement, which had been in place since 1994. But as the G20 meeting gets underway, the president's decision to cancel talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin is making headlines. So Major Garrett is traveling with the president in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Major, it looks lovely there. You started very early in the morning, nice. I'm sure. So the president said that he canceled the meeting with Putin yesterday because the Russians continue to hold 20 or so Ukrainian sailors and 3 Ukrainian vessels that they seized last week. But, you know, the announcement comes shortly after we learned that Michael Cohen has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress, that he's cooperating with the Mueller investigation. So how do you think we should view Trump canceling these meetings?
More than coincidental. Clearly, the Michael Cohen development would have followed and has followed President Trump here to the G20. And in any encounter with Vladimir Putin, there would have been shouted questions about what Vladimir Putin or his government knew or didn't know. There are revelations in the Michael Cohen pleading about Putin's press secretary or spokesman having some interaction with Cohen about this so-called Moscow project. All of that would have been here and sort of bubbling around the surface of any encounter. And there were supposed to be 2 between President Trump and President Putin. So you can't take that out of the equation. And yet, it's worth pointing out, this aggression carried out last weekend by Russia, I mean, seriously, seizing naval vessels from Ukraine and holding hostage more than 20 members of the Ukrainian Navy, that is the most brazen act of military aggression by Russia against Ukraine on President Trump's watch. It's a significant development. And how this administration deals with Russia, whether it with European partners applies more sanctions, does other things, maybe in terms of accelerating lethal weapons exports to Ukraine, more training of Ukrainian military personnel. I mean, this is a significant foreign policy development, and it will play out a little bit here in the G20, but President Trump's going to have to deal with it when he gets back to Washington. And Vladimir Putin essentially okaying this right before the G20, knowing he had scheduled meetings with President Trump, is clearly a signal that he's not afraid of whatever the United States or the European allies might do when it comes to Ukraine. That's a significant signal to President Trump that whatever he thinks his relationship might be with Russia and Vladimir Putin, Putin was clearly willing to be brazen, militarily aggressive, and take whatever consequences. And a couple of canceled meetings, possibly the Russians built that into their set of expectations. But today, upon Putin's arrival here in Buenos Aires, Moscow said it believes the 2 meetings were canceled for, quote, domestic reasons, unquote, in the U.S., a clear implication they think the Cohen development was the driving force.
Yeah, that is so interesting because in an odd way, the Cohen development, as you put it, almost gave the president cover in a weird way to cancel the meeting. So let's talk about the meeting that he's going to be having with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. We just talked about how he signed the new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. That had been contentious. It is no longer. And of course, trade is at the top of the agenda as he meets with the Chinese. So what can we expect with this meeting?
Well, the preliminary guidance given to us by senior White House economic advisors is this Saturday dinner with Xi Jinping is an enormously high-stakes moment for both countries, and possibly in this calendar year the last best opportunity to avert a full-blown trade war. $250 billion in tariffs are scheduled to begin against China January 1st. Another $267 billion have been threatened on top of those. President Trump said yesterday on the South Lawn he likes the idea of tariffs. He believes that they're working. And he thinks China wants a deal, but he's not so sure he wants to cut a trade deal with China. That's interesting. The president saying he thinks China wants to cut a deal, because every word we've gotten from the president's senior economic advisors and trade negotiators is that China's not interested in changing any of its behaviors on trade at all. As a matter of fact, they were described as spending the last 4 or 5 months not in negotiations with the United States, but paying lip service to Trump administration demands on more U.S. access to Chinese markets and fairer trade practices. So this is all boiling and coming to a head here in Argentina. As a matter of fact, it's considered the biggest global economic issue here at the G20, dwarfing every other issue the G20 nations might be bringing to the table to debate among themselves. What happens with the United States and China, and if there's a full-blown trade war, could have economic effects influencing not just those two countries, but global trade itself. So a lot of nations here are going to be sort of watching what happens, what comes of this dinner on Saturday, and more importantly, what may not come of it, and if the tariffs continue and the trade war, which is right now, I think, better classified as a trade skirmish, takes on even greater significance.
Still massive economies going at each other. You know it's going to have a ripple effect. Very quickly, before you leave, I have to ask about President Trump meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This is the first time he's going to see him since the Jamal Khashoggi murder case. What can we expect?
Not a meeting, and not even a glancing sort of pull aside, which often happens at summits of this kind, where leaders will get together for a couple minutes, say hello, and maybe exchange a couple of ideas. The word we get from the White House is the president is going to try his best to skirt any direct contact with the Crown Prince, keep the relationship where it is, but have no pictures suggesting that the president is indifferent to or not really caring very much about this underlying human rights violation, which has attracted a tremendous amount of attention.
It certainly has. Major Garrett, thank you so much.
Sure.
So